Paula, just give me a cue when you're ready to go live.
We'll just wait a couple more minutes.
Can you hear me, Paula?
Yes, yes.
Just give me a cue when we're ready.
Okay, okay. We'll just give a couple minutes here.
Also, in your remarks, Paula, just don't forget to mention that they should keep their cameras off, except for these panelists. Okay, thank you.
So for those of you just logging in, we'll be getting started in just a few minutes.
Okay, Perrine, do you want to get the live stream going and we'll get started? Welcome to everyone who's joined us on the Zoom platform and who are watching on our Facebook live stream. Welcome to our English for Career Development series. My name is Paula Masad, and I'm the English Language and Education Advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Doha. Today's session is about how to prepare for that job interview. A very important session, a very important thing for you to prepare for as you're looking for a job. And we're really excited to have Hensa Maria as our moderator for the panel. Hensa, I'll turn it over to you. And before I do that, please keep your videos turned off, and we'll have time at the end for questions. And in the meanwhile, if you'd like to type any questions in the chat box, we'll address those during the Q&A time. Thank you. Hensa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you here with us, and we're happy to discuss this very important topic with you because we all apply for jobs or internships or grad schools or any of those things. And, every time we have an interview come up, we do get a little intimidated. And so it's very exciting to have these panelists with us who will tell us the art of interviewing well and perhaps also the do's and don'ts of interviews and many, many more exciting things. So thank you for joining us. Before we proceed any further, let me introduce our distinguished panelists for today. Our first panelist for today is Miss Andrea from the US Embassy in Qatar, Miss Paige from Qatar Career Development Center, and Miss Laura from ConocoPhillips. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we proceed any further, we will have our panelists tell us a little about their own stories, tell us a little about their own experiences and what they've felt during different points whenever they've had to interview. So Ms. Page, will begin with you. Can you introduce yourself and the sort of interviews you've participated in? What has interviewing been like for you? What have how important do you think it is?
Thank you, Hamza, and welcome everyone. As I said, my name is Paige McDonough, and I am a Career Development Officer at the Qatar Career Development Center, or QCDC. So the question about my experience with interviews. So working in as a career advisor, I provide a lot of guidance to students on how to effectively interview. However, I will say prior to getting into this field, when I started my very first interview, it was not so great. You learn things as you go. I had not sought out any support from any career advisor within my university or school early enough. So I hope that I can help you maybe avoid some of the mishaps that many people happen to fall into. But Hamza, you also asked about how important interviews are. They are incredibly important. When you apply for a job, your application arrives with many others. If you get selected for an interview, it's a big deal. It means that they've already identified something that they really like about you, and they want to get to know you a little bit more. So they're really important. They can be the difference between getting the job or not getting the job. So they're a very big deal and very important. So I hope to be able to tell you a little bit more, some tips and do's and don'ts going forward.
I'm really glad we have this opportunity to learn from you, and we have this opportunity to impress these employers even further so that they give us nice jobs and internships. Miss Laura, can you tell us a little about your experience and how important do you think interviewing is, and particularly as an HR professional?
Sure. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation. I'm honored to be here. And, I don't know if I'm going to have much more to add. Paige summarized that really well, but just a little bit about myself. I'm the HR manager at ConocoPhillips Qatar. I've just joined Qatar. I moved here in March, so I'm new to the country, but prior to being here, I was both in Texas and Alaska with ConocoPhillips, and then worked in the healthcare, oil, and semiconductor business prior to that. But echo Paige's thoughts that the interview is probably the most important component of the onboarding hiring process. So it's really important that you do your homework to make sure that you come into that interview as well prepared as possible. And hopefully over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we can chat a bit more about what that looks like. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Miss Andrea.
Thank you,
Ms. Andrea, can we hear from you about your experience and sort of your journey with interviewing and how important do you think they are?
Absolutely. So I am now the Human Resources Officer at Embassy Doha. I've been here for 2 years, but I've worked in human resources for about 15 years now. And I've had experience all over the interviewing process, from preparing interviewees to take interviews, to preparing supervisors to lead really great interviews, to participating in interviews myself as a human resources professional. and they are absolutely critical. The interview is really that first opportunity that we get to go from seeing you on a piece of paper from your resume to actually seeing who you are as a person and how you interact with the hiring team, how you present yourself professionally, how you communicate verbally. So the interview is an excellent opportunity to really demonstrate why you are the best candidate for an opportunity.
Thank you. So every time an interview comes up, we tend to get nervous. We don't know how to prep for it. Or when we're preparing, we sometimes tend to over-prepare. So before we proceed any further, let's understand, how can we best prepare for an interview? Do we research for it? Do we rehearse our answers? What do we do before the interview? Miss Paige, can you guide us a little about that?
Yes, thank you, Hansa. So you definitely want to prepare for the interview, and there's several different ways to go about doing this. First thing, you want to ensure that you've researched the organization thoroughly. You want to go back and reread the position description that you're going to be interviewing for. You want to familiarize yourself with what are some current trends in the industry, what is the organization working on, because you want to demonstrate to that employer your genuine enthusiasm and interest to get involved, and your knowledge, demonstration of your knowledge of what they're working on will help get that across. So that's the first thing. Make sure that you research as much as you can about the organization and about the role that you're going to be applying or interviewing for. As well, see if there's a job structure or organization structure on their website too, because this can give you a better idea of how your role might interact with the organization as a whole. So definitely do your research before going into an interview. Now, in terms of rehearsing your answers, so I always advise interviewees to make sure that they have scenarios thought up in advance, but not to rehearse specific examples. So prepare for common behavioral questions, things about your strengths or your weaknesses, by thinking of a scenario, maybe a big project that you've worked on previously, maybe it was a big assignment you had, that you can extract maybe strengths or weaknesses from that. But you don't want to rehearse an answer because it will come across exactly as rehearsed and not organic, and you want to be more of a conversation. So I would say those are two of my big tips. Research the organization, the industry as much as possible, and start to prepare yourself by thinking of experiences that you've had, but not to rehearse your answers.
So as we're preparing for our interviews and as we're thinking about some of the common questions interviewers ask us, can you, Miss Laura, tell us about some of the common interview questions that people ask, or that we can sort of think about, or sort of try to think of as case studies, so to prepare ourselves better? Miss Laura?
Sure. So I know at least my company, we like to ask very kind of specific behavioral based questions. So asking about specific times when something occurred and how you responded. And so would kind of advise that you think about, like Paige said, the projects you've been on, the interactions you've had with people, and what actually happened versus how you would behave in that situation. So think about those experiences that you've had and begin to prepare. I actually have an example, so I'll read in front of me right here. So some types of those behavioral interview example questions that I see come up frequently are, give me an example of a difficult problem you solved, and how did you solve this problem? Or can you tell me about a challenging situation you overcame at work? Explain a situation in which you would have handled things differently. And I guess a piece of that I would think about is don't be prepared to focus only on the good. You probably want to think about some of those things that didn't go that well, but how you would handle it now and would plan to overcome it in the future. But it is the behavioral based questions that I see a lot of companies utilizing.
Thank you so much. So as we prepare to, answer questions like these behavior-based questions, Can you tell us, Miss Andrea, is there some sort of structure to answering questions? Should we, are there any tips to answering those questions? Is there a specific way we should think about them when we hear those questions?
There absolutely is, Kansa. If you do some research on different interviewing styles, you'll find a lot of tips about different methods and different tactics that are out there. And what you really want to focus on is you want to be detailed and specific in your answer, but you also want to be succinct. And so there's a method that I personally really like. It's called the STAR method. And with that, it fits very well with Laura's behavior-based interview questions that she was talking about a moment ago. And for that, you want to focus on what was the situation. So lay out what the context is of what was happening. What was the task that you were assigned to do? What action did you take? And then what was the result of that action? And so if you put those four things together, that gives you a detailed, really specific example without kind of going way overboard, giving a very long, drawn out answer to one question.
Absolutely. So one of the very common questions that employers ask, but also generally that you hear a lot is, tell me about yourself. And every time somebody asks this question, it sort of leaves you questioning who you are and sort of thrusts you in this midlife crisis. So Ms. Page, can you tell us a little about how we can answer this question? How long it should take for us to answer this question? Should we tell them everything about ourselves, or how does it work?
Sure. Thank you, Hamza. So this question seems very innocent, but it often trips people up. So interviewers will usually use the tell me about yourself question at the start of an interview to sort of bridge the conversation. When they ask you to tell me about yourself, they're not looking for your life history. They're not asking you what your favorite band is or your favorite hobbies. What they want to know is a very brief overview of your professional experience. So you want to keep your answer relatively concise. There's no magic number, but I would say maximum 2 minutes, maybe only 1 minute. But essentially, you just want to provide them with a brief overview of your educational experience and your professional experience. And that's really it in a synopsis. So don't overthink it. You don't need to go into detail. They will start to prompt you with additional questions, but it's just a nice way to say, here's who I am, here's what I've done briefly, and I'm very excited to be here interviewing for your organization today.
All right, I think that was very helpful for me, because every time this question comes up, I think about how I should answer it. And I think it takes me a while to come up with that perfect answer. So every time one talks about preparing for an interview, sometimes people tell you to perhaps prepare some questions for your employer. How important is it to prepare questions for your employer, or how many questions should you prepare? What kind of questions should they be? Ms. Laura, can you tell us?
Sure. So, my advice is that it is very important to prepare a couple questions ahead of the interview. I think that showing that you have additional questions and are seeking more information about the company indicates that you are interested in the company, and kind of lack of having those questions could give the impression that you're either not prepared, you're not knowledgeable, or not interested in the company. So definitely have a few questions prepared in case there is time to ask them. Perhaps over the course of the interview, the additional questions will come up naturally, but would not recommend that if the interviewer opens it up for questions that you say that you don't have any. So have some prepared. They can be as general as kind of company culture questions, or career development, or more specific to the role that you have, or how you would plan to interact with the team or supervisor. So it really depends on what's important to you and what you value, because remember that while they are interviewing you, you're also interviewing them to ensure that it's a mutual match. So just make sure you've got some questions ready to ask, and take the lead from the interviewer. If your interview has gone long, perhaps don't pull out a list of 10 questions, and you might be invited to ask them later if the interview process continues.
All right, so definitely we'll go prepared with some questions and with some clarifications perhaps if needed. So my next question is for Miss Andrea. So every time we're preparing for an interview, we're obviously looking at what comes along with getting that job, whether that is the salary package or the sort of work requirements. So can we negotiate during an interview if we have, a problem with something, or if we require a certain concession, or if we need accommodations, or any of those things? Should we bring that up and negotiate within the interview, or should we email them once we get the job? How do you think that works?
I would not recommend negotiating during the interview. You don't know at that point if you actually have the job. You're merely a candidate. However, if there's something that you're really interested in, for example, if you're interested in a flexible work schedule or career development opportunities, or there are certain make and break options of the job, I recommend that you ask about those during the interview to learn more about what those opportunities are for you, and so that you know if this is the right fit for you. If you're offered the job after the interview, then that's an opportunity for you to talk with the hiring manager and or the recruiter about figuring out what that offer is actually going to consist of.
Okay, so we should definitely avoid negotiating or arguing or any of those things within our interviews. Ms. Page, what else should we avoid doing within an interview?
Yeah,
Or
so
sort of what are the don'ts, things that you don't do at all in an interview?
Definitely. So one of the big don'ts is you don't want to speak negatively. If they ask you about why did you leave your previous organization, or tell us about a challenging coworker, you never want to speak negatively. Even if you'd had a terrible experience, you always want to just focus on how did you resolve it, or if it was, you left a previous organization, it's more that you're looking for different opportunities, but you never want to speak negatively about previous organizations or colleagues. You want to reflect positively. So make sure that you're always putting a positive spin on your answers. So that's a big one, is to avoid being negative. Another thing that I would avoid is one-word answers. Sometimes employers might ask close-ended questions, such as, do you have experience with Microsoft Word? Well, your answer might be yes. And yes, that does answer the question, but even if they don't ask you for more details, you should tell them more details. So your answer should be something like, yes, I have experience with this. Here is an example. Let me tell you a little bit about my experience. So you always want to avoid one-word answers, even if that's how the question is posed to you. So I think those are my two big ones. Again, always be honest, so avoid lying. If they ask you if you have experience with something and you don't, you should be honest with them. You don't want to say that you have experience in something that you don't. So avoid lying as well. Be honest, be positive, and always give them as much information as needed.
Miss Andrea or Miss Laura, would you like to add anything to this question? Okay, so, sorry. Okay. Just sorry, go ahead.
I was not going to add, I don't know, I think there was just a technical glitch there. So.
Oh, never mind. I think my Zoom is a little wonky today, but that's fine. So my next question is, as we're talking about do's and don'ts of interviewing, my next question is from Miss Laura. Can you tell us a little about any cultural implications of, body language? Is there some specific kind of action that reflects badly, or something that we should be aware of as far as our body language is concerned?
Sure. So I will defer a bit to Paige or Andrea if there's anything specific culturally here in Qatar that I might not yet be aware of. But as far as I would just say, general body language, sit up straight, maintain eye contact, project confidence, lean into the conversation, avoid too much hand movement, but be yourself, right? I'm someone that naturally speaks with my hands, so a little is fine, but you know, I think that, but you want to lean into the conversation. You want to be actively engaged. You don't want to be distracted. You don't have your cell phone out, so that's not even an option as far as any perception of you not being fully engaged. And then as far as any kind of local cultural body language considerations, I will defer to my esteemed panelists who have been here longer if they have anything to contribute in that as far as that goes.
All right. So I'm sure they can definitely add on a lot of things for us. But as we think about body language, I think my next question sort of fits into this as well, because we're all in this pandemic, and so we're now giving virtual interviews. So Miss Andrea, perhaps you could add on to the previous question, but also tell us how we can prepare for virtual interviews, because obviously the landscape is different. You can't sort of signal your interest or anything that you want to say the same way as you would if you were giving an interview in person.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say about preparing for a virtual interview is you should always check your technical setup before the interview. You want to make sure that your Zoom is set up, that your camera and your audio work, that you have a professional background. So I don't need to see your bed if you're having an interview from your bedroom. Similarly, you also want to look professional. You don't have to join the interview in your pajamas if you're in your bedroom. You should still be wearing a suit and dress professional. It will also help you to feel more confident during the interview and more engaged as part of that interview. It's also a good idea to have a copy of your resume in front of you, just so you can glance down depending on what questions are. You can jog your memory, especially if you get nervous. That can be really helpful, and it's not quite as noticeable in a virtual interview as it might be if you're sitting in the same room with your interviewers. You want to make sure that you're making sure that you're engaging with your interviewers, that you can see their reactions, note if they start to speak, you know, pay attention to those technical lags so that you don't jump on top of someone if they're trying to speak as much as possible. The virtual interviews can be a little bit awkward, so sometimes you just need to take a breath and go with it and give it a second, and it will be a great interview in the end.
All right, so I will definitely make sure that I don't wear my pajamas during my next interview, and that I have my CV on hand, and that I dress professionally for my virtual interview. While we're talking about that, let's talk about some of the weird questions employers might ask. So Ms. Page, can you tell us a little about what are some of the weird questions that employers might ask, and how do we deal with them?
Sure. So with these questions, I would say don't, these aren't the norm questions, but I've worked with hundreds of university students in the past, and these are examples that they've told me that they've been asked before. And it's good just to be prepared, I think, for anything. So I think this is the takeaway with these questions, but just to give you some ideas, and I think these are always a little bit entertaining nonetheless to hear. I have had students who've been asked really odd questions in interviews before, such as, if you were to identify with an animal, what animal would that be? Same thing about a color. If you were to identify with a color, what color would that be? And I've even had one student been asked to tell a joke in an interview. Now, like I said, these are not normal questions. I would not anticipate that many of you or any of you would get these questions. But like I said, I have had students who've been asked these questions. And the point of them is to see if you can think on your feet. That's really what they were trying to see, is how quickly can you respond when you're confronted with something really unusual. So my advice is, if you get confronted with something that you're uncertain of, whether it's a really bizarre question like that, or if you just need a minute to even think about your answer for a standard question, don't hesitate to say, that's a really good question. Do you mind if I take a minute to just think about that? Take a few seconds, formulate an answer, and then reply to them. So I would use this guidance for whether it's a weird question or a standard question that you just need a little bit of time. That's certainly acceptable to do. And it allows you time to gather your thoughts and come up with an answer. And I would say too, if it's a really strange question like that, just try to come up with something. Even if you aren't really sure, just try to answer something, because again, they're to see how quickly you can think on your feet. But I think the most important takeaway is be prepared for anything, but do feel comfortable to ask for a minute or so to formulate an answer so that you do feel confident in what you're going to say.
All right, I will definitely research for some jokes that I can tell my future interviewers, because, well, I don't think I'm very good with those, but we'll see. Miss Laura, can you tell us a little about some funny situations that might come up within interviews? How do you deal with them, and whether interviewers might sometimes create them to discover something about an interviewee?
You know, both the question that was just asked and that, I think that those were probably the extremes and one-offs. And so if I were giving any, very candid advice, which I am doing, is I'd spend my time preparing the questions that they're going to ask. The behavior-based questions, your interest, tell me about a time when, why are you the candidate for the job, why this particular company, and not get stressed out about the other questions, because they are going to ask those standard questions and you want to be best prepared for those. So I wouldn't worry about the one-off situations. And if they do happen, what Paige said, ask for some time. It's even appropriate, I think, to say, what, can we come back to that question later? Which at that time they might come back to it, or they might not and just moved on. I think what they're looking for is that you can remain calm under pressure, that you're able to process things, that you don't get too frazzled. And, that would be my advice on those. Yeah.
So other than funny situations and weird questions, how do I really market myself? Do I do it on the basis of what the company has advertised, or what I feel to be my best qualities? Or how does one really market themselves, so to say? Miss Andrea?
So the best thing to do is to focus on what the company is looking for and how you can best exemplify that. When you're in the interview, you're going to be asked questions that are about the competencies that the company is looking for, right? Maybe they're looking for somebody with really strong multitasking skills, or communication skills, or technological skills. And so what you want to be able to do is to pull experiences from your own background that best illustrate how you demonstrate those competencies that the company is looking for. And if you're able to do that in a really strong way for the interviewers, it'll put you out as a front runner candidate for that job.
So it'll just, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add one thing to what Andrea said there, is how to kind of put your best foot forward with that. Is the company that I'm currently with, I interviewed 4 times, 4 separate jobs before I got the one that I was ultimately hired for. And I was told each time that I was the second runner-up candidate for it previously. And I said, well, what's it going to take to finally land the job? And the feedback that I got was that every time I interviewed, the hiring manager liked me, but they didn't feel like I really wanted the job. And that was my own doing, because I was trying to kind of play it cool. And so the feedback that I got with the next job interview that I did is I didn't play it cool. I let them know that I really wanted to work for ConocoPhillips, and I thought that this was the right job for me, and I was excited. And I got that job. So, I think that's one thing that's a piece of advice, is make sure when you're in the interview that you're excited, that let them know you're excited about the job, that you want to work for that company, and that you're, willing to do what it takes to be successful in that job. So.
Oh, so I guess you also answered my second question. I was going to ask you who gets the opportunity to interview. Does that mean I'm hired? But I guess, if you get the interview, it doesn't mean you're hired. You still continue showing your best self and you still continue showing your interest. So sometimes after interviews, we don't hear back from our employers, and it is, sort of nerve-wracking to just be sitting there waiting. So should we send them a follow-up email? Should we ask them about it? How should we proceed with that, Ms. Page?
Sure. So this I will also include, going back to what we talked about earlier, the questions at the end of the interview to ask. One question, if the interviewers don't tell you, but one question I would make sure to always ask is to say, shall I follow up with you, or will you be reaching out to me? And what sort of time frame? That way you know what to expect. Like I said, many will actually say, we're going to finish up our interviews this week. We should let you know by next week. But if they don't say something to that effect, then you should ask that and say, what's the next step from here? Should I follow up with you, or will you follow up with me? That way you confirm that at the end of the interview. If then they said that they would follow up with you within a week's time, and it's been a week and you haven't yet heard from them, it's okay to send another email and say, I just wanted to follow up. I was expecting to hear back, and I just wanted to see where you're at in the process. So it's okay to make sure that you do that. But again, clarify expectations at the end of the interview, so each of you knows who's going to be contacting that person. And then it's okay if that time has elapsed and you haven't yet heard back, to go ahead and send a follow-up interview. Because again, like Laura was saying, you want to show that you're keen. So if you haven't heard back in the time that they've allocated, follow up with them.
Okay, so we will definitely follow up. But what if you don't get that job? What if they send you an email and they tell you that somebody else got that job? Miss Andrea, can you tell us a little about what we should do? Is there any kind of follow-up that we should be doing if we don't get a specific job that we've interviewed for?
Sure. There's definitely some follow-up that you can do. One, it's always great still to just thank the employer for the opportunity, for being invited to interview in the first place, because that is a great opportunity, and you made it that far. You should be really proud of that. But you can also ask for some feedback, just like Laura was talking about. Why didn't you get the job? Maybe there's something that you can be working on to improve yourself for future opportunities, either with that employer or with another employer.
I think you're on mute, Hamza.
So, all right, I guess I'm unmuted now. So we should definitely ask for feedback, and definitely also reapply to that company, as we learned from Miss Laura's story. Perhaps you will get hired another time. One last question from Miss Laura. If you end up getting that job and you start working with that company, should you get some kind of feedback about your interview, or is that it?
I wouldn't expect to get feedback about the interview if you get the offer, because at that point, I think that the interview went fairly well. But if you are keen to continue developing your interviewing skill set, which you should be, because even once you're hired with the company, you'll be considered for other opportunities within that company or elsewhere. Down the line, I do not think that it would hurt, especially as you develop more of a comfortable relationship with who potentially you hired, to ask them to reflect and go back to the interview and give you feedback. Now that you have a more comfortable relationship, they might be more willing to share, kind of maybe what you did well or what you could go ahead and improve on.
Come to an end. But it's time for you, our participants, to ask us questions, to engage with us, to give us your thoughts, to give us your perspectives. So come forward with your questions, and I'm sure our panelists will guide you and will make your interviewing experience smoother. Ms. Paula, can you tell us about some of the questions we got?
Right now, we don't have any questions in the chat box, but please do participants who are on the Zoom call, please do enter the questions in the chat and we'll be happy to take them. But I have one question. When it comes to the end of the interview, you're often asked, do you have any questions for us? Should the candidate be prepared for questions or just say, no, I don't have any questions?
Yeah, so I think we spoke briefly about that, but definitely have questions prepared. I think as it was maybe Laura mentioned, if you say no, you don't have questions, it maybe kind of demonstrates or shows that you're not as interested in the employer. You definitely want to have questions. And again, as Laura was saying, you take the cue from the interview. If it's been quite a while, you don't need to hit them with 10, 15 questions, but you could ask a few questions. Things like, these are a few questions I personally also like to ask is, what does success look like in this role? That helps you kind of establish what are they looking for and also what do they need in a candidate to be successful in this position? So that's a question you could ask them. You could also ask them, what are some of the biggest challenges facing this role? That also helps you get an idea of what you're going into and what to expect. You could also ask questions about the team dynamics, who's on the team, the company culture, things of that nature. But it's always, like we said, a good idea to have questions asked or have questions prepared. And also, if the organization, if you know that they're working on some really cool projects and you're not quite sure if your role would be able to get involved with those projects, that's a question you could ask. You could say, oh, I have seen on your LinkedIn profile that you posted you've got this new initiative, whatever it is, you're really interested in it. Is that something you could get involved with? So it's always a good idea to have questions prepared and have questions that demonstrate not only your interest in the organization, but also your knowledge of the organization as well as the industry.
I would add to Paige's answer as well that in addition to having questions prepared, it's a good idea to listen to the panelists during the interview and see if you might have an additional question to ask based on what you've been told during the interview, because that also demonstrates a level of engagement and interest that you're really invested in the interview and now you want to know even more.
That's great guidance. We do have a couple questions that come in. It says, what if I'm a recent graduate with no prior job experience? How should I answer if I'm asked about a situation that I've handled well?
So I can take that one. Everyone certainly coming into an interview is going to have varying level of past professional experience. So you should definitely prepare ahead of time and think about situations in your social life, in your academic life, when you worked on project teams. I think that what they're really looking for is how you handled a problem, how you addressed it, kind of going back to that STAR method that Andrea mentioned. And you can pull that from interactions you've had with your family, even if it was a babysitting job. It's fine. It's really just they're wanting to see how you respond to challenges and what the actions were that you took to do that.
Yeah, they could even refer to probably a school experience.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't something that was challenging at university.
Right.
Now, we have a question here. It says, I've gotten asked previously about what I hate. It feels like a trick question. What's a way to answer this in a positive way?
Say that you hate trick questions. I don't know if I actually have any good guidance. I think that's kind of goes back to what I said earlier, that I would try not to focus too much on that. And you could even turn the question around on the interview and say, rather than talking about what I hate, I don't like getting caught up in negativity. I prefer to be positive, and I'll tell you what I love, and go from there. Because you do want to stay positive, like Paige said. So you might even just turn it back around.
Yeah.
And I might add to that as well. Like I've been asked a similar question, something along the lines of, what do you find annoying in a colleague? And as I said, you don't want to ever say, oh, I find it really annoying when my colleague does this. So the way that I would maybe approach this question is, you might say, kind of as Laura was saying, well, I don't want to talk about hate, but what I personally find very important is, when someone has really clear communication. So I try to ensure that I have clear communication, because I find that teams work better something to that effect. So you're not saying that you hate poor communication, but what you're trying to do is say, rather than that, I focus on, positive communication or something to that effect. So it is a little bit of a tricky question. And they have probably maybe worded it in a way to see how you might answer. So what I would focus on, as we said, is to try to take it and say, what do you like, perhaps, as compared with what do you hate? And you might even say, I don't like to use the word hate. So you can turn it around maybe a little bit that way.
You can also turn it around as a resilience answer. This is the part of my job that I didn't like, but here's what I did to, make it more tolerable or make it more fun or engaging or developing for me. And you can build on it that way.
It reminds me of the question about what is your weakness? It's kind of a similar sort of, turning it around to make it a positive.
And I'll add one more thing as we said that. So any of these like negative based questions, what I think also employers are looking for is, as Andrea just said, how did you overcome that? So if they ask you about a challenge or a mistake that you've made, the answer is no, I've never made a mistake, or the answer shouldn't be no, I've never made a mistake, but how have you overcome it? So if there's something you hate or something that annoys you, how did you overcome that? Just as Andrea said, so focusing on that element.
Okay, and then we have a couple more questions. The next one is, what is the best proofs about my old experience? Is the photo of my old experience can support me? What is the best proof about my old experience?
I'll answer, I think, a bit of that. So when an employer asks you about your experience, they're expecting you to be honest. They're not going to say, provide me with documentation or photos of this project that you did. They're expecting you to be honest. So that's why whenever you apply, you also submit references, people who can basically say, yes, they worked with me or whatnot. So your references can basically back you up whenever they contact your references. So I think maybe that's might address your question, hopefully.
Okay. And thank you, Paige. The next question is, what are some different expectations for group interviews differently than for a one-to-one interview? Do you have any comments on group interviews?
So I'll answer that. And of course, please add anything. My opinion of the group interviews are just trying to get more bang for the buck. So any advice that we would have that we've given for the assumption of a one-on-one interview is the same for a group interview. They're just trying to get you in front of more people to get their opinions on if you might be a good fit for the company. So the only thing you would need to be mindful of is really, to maintain that eye contact, ensure that you're speaking to each of the panelists, that you're engaging with each of them, and just kind of be mindful of that and try to, be respectful of each of them equally.
Okay. Then we have somebody going back to what we were just discussing. Wouldn't turning a question around seem like dodging the question, and would that be bad? I don't know if Andrea wants to address that.
You don't want to avoid answering the question that you're being asked. But like we said, if you're building upon it, right? This is what I disliked, but this is how I overcame that. This is what I learned from it. This is how I grew from that experience. That's great, because you're even advancing your answer to that question. You're giving the employer more than what they've asked for.
Thank you, Andrea. Paige, this goes to you. It says, Hanan says, Miss Paige, you said we shouldn't speak negatively, but what if they ask me to describe my personal strengths and I consider a negative thing like my strong point? I was through, people keep telling me you should mention depression, or that you had a gap year to overcome a depression. Keep telling me I should lie about it and say that you were doing something important like volunteer activity. Ooh, I'm thinking she's saying about being straightforward and honest.
Yeah, I think if I get the gist of your question, if you've taken a gap year or if you've had any kind of illness, whether physical illness, mental illness, that bit is private and confidential. You don't necessarily need to tell an employer that. You don't need to disclose that up front. You want to stick to professional-based questions. If it's about your strength, maybe what you're trying to get across is, how you've overcome a difficult period of your life, and maybe that's what you can focus on. And so you can say, I had a really difficult period of my life. I recognize that maybe some things weren't quite right. So what I did to fix them were I did these things, and this helped me this way. So now I feel more resilient, and I will take these learnings into my job. So the amount you want to disclose is up to you. It can be a very personal choice, but if it's demonstrating your strength, that you got through something that's really tough, you can speak about that experience kind of generally and say, I had a tough time. But these were the things that I actively did to overcome that and get through it. And this is how I will apply it to that role. So focusing on it in that way to show exactly the actions that you took and exactly how that helped increase whatever your resilience and how you will apply that in the position. I hope that addressed the question.
Thanks, Paige. I think that's wonderful guidance. You don't need to overshare, but share what's relevant and try to keep it positive, I think. I don't know if Andrea or Laura would like to add anything to that.
I think Paige covered it quite well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Those are all the questions. Did anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask?
I don't have a question at the moment or something else, but I wanted to mention to everyone something else to prepare for an interview. And this is a really important question that frequently, almost in every interview, they might ask some variation of that. And it is, why should we hire you? Or why are you the right candidate for this role? Or why do you even want this job? These are questions, like I said, in some form or fashion that I would prepare to be asked in an interview. And you should be prepared to answer. And really think about, because honestly, first time you're confronted with this question, why should we hire you? It's a little bit awkward to say why you think you are the best candidate, but it's really important that you reflect on the position description that they posted, what were they looking for, and how that compares with your experience and your strengths. And you tell them specifically, I have these strengths, or I've done this before, and I know that I can support you with your, projects or whatever it might be. So really reflect on this question, because if you don't know why they should hire you, chances are they're not going to know either. So really think about what you would want to say if you're asked that question, and make sure that it's impactful. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I like that, Paige. And now is not the time to be meek or humble, brag, be confident, because the other people that are interviewing are going to do the same. So, be proud of your accomplishments and what you have to offer them.
And I think also to really know the company, to do their research about what that company is and why they want to work there, and really knowing that.
And also one other tip, Laura, when you said brag about yourself, I wanted to also mention how to do this in a way that you feel comfortable, because many people find it a little bit awkward as well to, say, oh, I'm so great at this, or I'm amazing at that. It just doesn't feel natural for many of us. So what I always advise is think about your skill. If you think, okay, I'm great at project management. Well, how do you know you're great at project management? Have you managed a project? What feedback did you get? Did it go smoothly? Did you finish on time? If you can tell that employer, this is my strength and here's an example, that is a way to demonstrate your skill without feeling just like you're bragging. It becomes a bit more objective because here's your experience, here's your example, rather than subjective. I'm saying that I'm so good at this and you have no idea if I am or not. So that is a way that I would really practice selling your strengths by giving those specific examples.
Thank you, Paige. Hansa, I'll turn it back over to you. We've answered all the questions in the chat. If anybody else has questions, please, we have a couple more minutes. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
Just Thank you everyone for joining us today, and make sure to follow the US Embassy and Qatar Career Development Center's social media. I'm sure that you will find a lot more content over there that will be helpful for your personal development as you prepare to apply to more jobs. We do have more sessions like this which we post over there. So do follow those pages and keep up to date with all the future sessions that we will organize. Ms. Page, I believe you wanted to share a feedback
I've
survey.
just put a survey in the chat.
Just 1 second before you address the survey, I just want to let participants know we are going to have another session in this series, and it will be about how to prepare for the job search. What's the most effective way to search for a job? So please join us for that on June 8th.
And I would also like to add too that QCDC, we offer virtual career advising sessions for free. So you can go to QCDC's website and you are able to book in for a free 45-minute guidance session with one of our advisors if you have further questions about interviews or job searching or whatever it may be. So that's available to you as well.
Okay, so Paige, just let us know about the survey.
It's just in the chat. So I've just put the link. If everyone could take a minute, it'll take less than 60 seconds to complete. That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I've learned a lot of things today. So I do hope my next interview will be better whenever and wherever that ends up being. And once again, thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope it was productive for you as well. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wow.